know we on the spot. I said we on the spot, on the spot, on the spotlight.
Yeah.
102.3 KJLH Compton, Los Angeles.
She's a native Angeleno, third generation, and she is your representative in our state legislature. Senator Holly Mitchell is with us this morning. Hello, Senator Mitchell. Good morning.
Good morning, Dominique, and I am most grateful for you and what you and this show brings to all of us in Los Angeles every day. So I appreciate being on the show. Thank you.
Well, it's good to hear from you. And you're my inspiration because not only you're a senator, you're also a mom. And multitasking like that is really serious business. And the thing about it is, I think we need more moms to be lawmakers because there are some common sense things that you won't understand if you've never been a mom. Not to be a sexist, but you won't understand if you haven't been a mom or a full-time dad, a stay-at-home dad. And I think a lot of us don't do it because it seems daunting.
I think it is daunting. That's true, but I think the mothers who are listening to your radio show this morning on their way to work, on public transportation, are all family members and parents who work every day to provide for their kids, certainly understand that life juggle. I just chose to take mine to Sacramento to try to create policies that really help everybody.
Well, and speaking of policies that help everybody, since the mass shooting in Las Vegas, there's been a lot of talk about what to do, how to make our country safer, how to make our nation safer. And of course, the issue of how to handle gun control or gun rights, depending on how you look at it, is in the spotlight. How would you describe the differences between California and other states? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about California being over the top by advocates of the Second Amendment, but others say we haven't done enough yet.
California, I'm proud to say, Dominique, was on the cutting edge 35 years ago in promoting and passing some of the most aggressive assault weapons bans in the country. Many years ago, when I was actually a staffer to the legislature, then President Pro Tem David Roberti and others, again, took a lot of heat nationwide for some of their early policies. And so for me, legislating in a state as progressive as California, to see that we can't seem to get much traction at the federal level, regardless of the efforts of some of our local Congress members, is really sobering, to say the least.
Well, I read that Dianne Feinstein was getting into it with some members of the legislature about just how far do we need to go. And of course she's representing us at the federal level, and you guys in the state legislature, have your own tools here. Is it a hot topic among legislatures on the state level right now about what to do and how far to go?
Oh, no question. And, of course, immediately after a tragedy like Las Vegas, it certainly comes to the forefront. But California residents need to know that it's something that's not far off our radar screen as local policymakers, on a daily basis. California is not an open carry state, for example. And that's a result of legislation that has been passed at the state level. It's often tried and tested on a consistent basis, but I'm glad to say my colleagues and I have remained firm. When the horrible shooting at the school took place in Connecticut, I heard from colleagues, specifically colleagues in the Legislative Black Caucus in the state of Connecticut, and looked at the legislation that they put into place for their state. And so your listeners need to really understand, that there are laws at the state level and the federal level. And again, at the state legislature, we're doing all we can to keep California safe. I often hear from the advocates who argue our constitutional rights to, quote unquote, bear arms. And I always call into question were assault weapons guaranteed under that right? We have to recognize that the Constitution was developed during a time where that amendment referred to a layperson militia. And so our forefathers, because they weren't our foremothers, as you and I know, our forefathers didn't envision a professional police force like the LAPD or the county sheriffs who are trained and have firearms and are trained to protect and serve. And so I think we can push back and call into question all of those constitutional advocates who are afraid that their quote-unquote right to bear arms will be challenged when all we're trying to do are protect U.S. citizens and California residents.
Well, Senator Mitchell, you know that I'm one of those, I guess, independent-minded progressives who feel like that, you know, many of us do want to bear arms. And many people say in our community that the gun control movement got traction in our state when Black Panther Party and, other activist groups started exercising that right. So the question becomes, and we have a lot of listeners here on this show who want to have the right to have a weapon legally. I mean, you look at what happened this weekend, Richard Spencer marching again in Charlottesville, with a bunch of people carrying tiki torches and basically Nazis marching in Charlottesville. For some of us, that's a wake-up call that says, well, I want to be able to protect my home. And so what's the balance there between those of us who do want to be able to have a weapon and not having a country which allows or encourages this kind of mass, carnage?
Dominique, I think that we really, as a civil society, have to step back and really check ourselves, to be perfectly honest. In recent months, I've learned a great deal about Australia and the actions Australia took after their first mass shooting. And here we are, entering double digits in terms of the number of mass shootings we've experienced as a country. And so we have to decide and define for ourselves, what does it mean to live in a civil society? There's no one who can justify, in my mind, a society in which automatic, semi-automatic firearms can be purchased, that can be augmented very easily at home. There's no one who can justify for me for either hunting purposes or, protecting one's family and home purposes, the kind of ammunition racks that are available that allow the mass shooter in Las Vegas to kill to shoot at and cause harm to hundreds per minute. And so, again, in my mind, when we're talking about the kind of firepower that has been engaged in these mass shootings, it just is not justified under the Constitution.
And some things seem like common sense, but apparently they do become controversial when it comes to federal law, like background checks, across the board, like people on terror watch lists not being able to purchase guns, like the fact that you really don't need automatic weapons for hunting purposes or even for home defense. So what can the average person listening who is in favor of sensible gun regulation, but also maybe supporting the Second Amendment, what can they do to support those people that have a sensible approach?
From what I hear from, quite frankly, NRA, National Rifle Association proponents, is that there's a concern that if they just even let a crack in the door. I mean, to hear the lobbyists in Sacramento and to hear them testify against, the Brady advocates, it's just really not logical in terms of we can't allow any adjustment or any policy go forward that would call into question our Second Amendment rights at all. And if I've learned nothing else, Dominique, in my 7 years serving in the legislature, is that, most public policy issues are not quite that black and white or quite that sophomoric. True policy negotiation that is in the best interest of the collective as a whole tends to be in the gray area. And so you can't simply say you can't, violate my Second Amendment right by limiting me at all. That's not true. From what I've heard with regard to the most recent mass shooting in Nevada, these firearms were purchased by this man legally. We have states that allow open carry. We have states that don't limit the amount of ammunition you can buy at one time or per month. So again, most policymaking is nuanced, and I would encourage your listeners to just not kind of fall for the hype that any limitation or control measure is a violation of their rights.
All right, turning the page here to another hot topic in our state. Governor Brown signed a bill making California a sanctuary state. And a lot of people talking about this. He did it right when the DACA deadline for those who are designated as dreamers, who have had some protection under the regulations put in place by President Barack Obama. Their deadline had come to get an extension for another 2 years. What does this mean, really, us being a sanctuary state?
Well, that's a really good question because it's again, policymaking is kind of in that gray area. It's nuanced. There's really no solid, concrete definition of what it means to be a, quote, sanctuary state. For me, when I voted in support of SB 54, it was to send a strong signal to the federal government that I did not believe in the racist, classist policies that they're putting forward. I spent my entire political career working on behalf of the least among us, and as an African-American woman, I do not subscribe to the current racist kind of baiting that's taking place, where we're looking at those who are earning the least, who are the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Volatile, the most challenged, quite frankly, in our community, to pit them against other members of our community. And so we are standing firm as a state legislature to say that we're not going to subscribe to the racist, classist policies that this new federal administration is putting forward. Our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has been very clear about not wanting ICE representatives to come into our court. He's been very clear that who we are standing up to protect are law-abiding immigrants in our community. So this notion that they represent a higher proportion of the criminal element in our society is simply false.
Now,
and that's really what this bill really fundamentally stands for.
But to be clear, the fact that California is now a sanctuary state does not mean that ICE or Immigration Customs Enforcement cannot do their job in the state of California. What it means is that law enforcement will not be aiding and assisting them. Is that correct?
Exactly. And so what it means is that ICE is a federal law enforcement entity, but we've been very clear that they can't misrepresent who they are, that they can't coerce local law enforcement to work in concert in supporting their deportation efforts. Exactly.
But meanwhile, from the federal level, we're being told that there will be a step up, possibly more raids, more enforcement by ICE in the state of California in retaliation for this legislation.
And, the unfortunate thing is that's very likely, Dominique. ICE and immigration policy is federal law. And so what we've tried to do at the state level is send a strong signal to the federal government that we're going to do everything within our power as a state jurisdiction to protect California residents. But you're right, it's a very dangerous, daunting issue that we're facing that I hope your listeners remember come 2018 when we have the opportunity to cast our votes again across this country and change the composition of Congress.
President Trump has made it clear that he would like to retaliate against California because of sanctuary laws to be probably one example. But President Trump, there's been some controversy about whether it's actually legal for President Trump to retaliate against California by withholding budget items, for example, in reaction to California passing the sanctuary state bill. What are your feelings about that? Are we going to suffer on a budget level and in other ways from Washington based on having taken this action?
Dominique, California is the fifth largest economy in the world, not the U.S., in the entire world. And so we've heard those threats. I believe they're idle threats from the current administration. Even with that, the California legislature has hired former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder to be our counsel. Our current state attorney general, Javier Becerra, has filed several lawsuits against the federal government to protect California residents' rights. And so we feel very confident under the letter of the law that we are operating within our purview as a state, and don't take his threats seriously, quite frankly, as he has suggested that he could withhold, federal budget dollars from California. We're clear about the health and integrity of our state budget. I'm budget chair for the state Senate. We passed a balanced budget this past year of $183 billion to provide critical services to California residents. And we're going to continue to operate as the progressive, innovative state that we are, recognizing really that not only the entire nation, but the entire world is looking to us to continue to stand up and fight for policies that we know are just and appropriate, policies surrounding climate change, surrounding immigration, all of the issues that we know are important to Californians.
Senator Holly Mitchell, speaking of standing up for people, you've been a fighter for the African American community your whole career, even before you were a lawmaker in your work around the issue of childcare. But there are some in our community that feel like as California lawmakers pass a sanctuary state law, as California lawmakers on the state level and in our municipalities are rushing to help DACA recipients, rushing to help immigrants, they are not rushing to help African Americans. We continue to see African Americans shot by police. We continue to see African American unemployment higher than any other group by miles. And so some feel that there is an inequality or lack of equity in the amount of protection given by lawmakers on the federal, state, and local level to provide sanctuary to immigrants as opposed to any kind of sanctuary or protection for African Americans.
And Dominique, it really troubles me when I hear that perspective come from African Americans, because from my perspective, it's one that's ill-informed. And I think it is precisely what this GOP and this administration would hope, that they could divide communities of color, they could divide communities that have historically been disenfranchised. And from my perspective, it simply isn't true. And I challenge people who have that perspective to look at my record, the record of our congressional Black Caucus members, our legislative Black Caucus members, and see the kind of work we do every day to benefit not only the African American community, but all disenfranchised Californians. I think that is exactly what they want to do in terms of a divide and conquer. Reverend Barber, William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign was here in Los Angeles several weeks ago, and I walked into that church on West Adams Boulevard and saw the most diverse socioeconomically and ethnically gathering of people I've seen in Los Angeles in a very long time. And he beautifully articulated how, the whole notion that if they come from my brother today and I say nothing, when they come from me tomorrow, there will be no one left to fight the fight. And so I am not buying in to that racist notion that I cannot stand for my Latino or my immigrant brothers and sisters and stand for myself as well. I think it's also important for your listeners to recognize how many Black people are impacted by these immigration policies too. I represent Little Ethiopia in Los Angeles. And there were a number of articles in the Huffington Post and the New York Times that talked about the number of Black people who are immigrants to this country as well. So it's not as simple to simply say you're not addressing the issues that impact Black people as some people perceive them by supporting DACA and our current immigrant population. I just don't buy that. And anyone can take a look at my state website or take a look at my voting record or the kind of bills I carry, the kind of budget advocacy I engage in every day, and know that to be true.
It's Radio Free 102.3 KJLH, Compton, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Inglewood. Senator Holly Mitchell, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Speaking about taking a look at your website and keeping up with what you're doing on social media, how can we do that? What are the addresses? Where are you in the world of new media?
Holly J. Mitchell. They can Google me to find the state website, my Facebook page, and I hope people will tune in and take a look at the criminal justice reform and juvenile justice reform package of bills I carried this year, along with my colleague, Senator Ricardo Lara. We've got 7 bills sitting on the governor's desk right now that will have drastic impact on our community in terms of preventing our people from going to jail as often as they do and keeping our young people out of the juvenile justice system. So I hope your listeners will tune in and reach out to the governor and say, hey, sign those bills authored by Senator Mitchell.
You got to come back soon. We need to do a whole show focused on that.
I would love to. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And again, the work you do on behalf of our community every day. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell.
KJLHradio.com.
You know we on the spot. I say we on the spot, on the spot, on the spotlight.